I'm Marcus Rivera, 32, a former Marine who came home to a family that couldn't see past their own disappointments. For 3 years, they dismissed my military service as playing soldier while I struggled to find my place in civilian life. Brother-in-law called my combat experience irrelevant at last month's family dinner. Right in front of my teenage nephew Jake, the words stung, but I kept my mouth shut again. But last Tuesday, when Jake's harmless party spiraled into something dangerous, everything changed. In 60 seconds of chaos, my irrelevant training became the only thing standing between my nephew and a situation that could have destroyed his future. What happened next didn't just save Jake, it forced my family to confront the truth about who I really am and who they'd chosen to ignore. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, this story is for you. 3 years ago, I stepped off the plane at LAX with my duffel bag slung over my shoulder and my discharge papers folded neatly in my breast pocket. The California sun felt different from the scorching heat of Afghanistan's, after somehow less threatening. But as I walked through the terminal, scanning faces for my family, I already felt the weight of something I couldn't quite name. Sarah was there first. My older sister with her perfectly styled hair and designer handbag, looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Behind her stood David, my brother-in-law, checking his phone even as he lifted his hand in what I supposed was meant to be a wave. 12-year-old Jake hung back, shy but curious, stealing glances at my uniform. "There's our hero," Sarah said. And I caught something in her voice, a forced brightness that made my stomach tighten. The hug felt obligatory, the kind you give at funerals or awkward family reunions. David shook my hand with the practiced grip of someone who'd learned that firm handshakes matter in business. "Good to have you back, Marcus. Ready to get back to real life?" Real life. The phrase would echo in my head for months afterward. The drive to Sarah's house in Calabasas was filled with questions that felt more like interrogation than curiosity. What were my plans? Had I thought about going back to school? David had connections in his company, nothing glamorous, but steady work for someone willing to start at the bottom. I stared out the window at the manicured lawns and identical houses, each one a monument to suburban success. Everything looked so clean, so safe, so far removed from the world I'd just left behind. The weight of my service rifle was still phantom heavy on my shoulder. I found myself checking exits and sight lines without thinking about it. "You'll figure it out," Sarah said, reaching back to pat my knee. "You just need time to adjust." But what she really meant, what they all meant, was that I needed to forget. The military was something I'd done, like a college phase or a bad relationship something. To move past and leave behind. I couldn't see that it wasn't just something I'd done. It was something I'd become. The discharge papers in my pocket felt heavier than any pack I'd carried overseas. They documented 3 tours, 2 commendations, and an honorable discharge. But sitting in the back of David's BMW, watching the suburbs roll by, I realized those papers might as well have been blank. In this world, in their world, none of it mattered. Jake was the only one who asked real questions. While the adults talked around me about practical things, apartments, job applications, health insurance, he wanted to know about the desert, about the people I'd met, about what it felt like to be so far from home. His questions were honest, uncomplicated by the need to fix me or redirect me towards something more acceptable. "Did you miss us?" he asked one evening as we sat on the back patio. I thought about the letters I'd written but never sent, the times I'd called home only to hang up before dialing, the way I'd carried their photo until it was worn soft at the edges. Every day. I told him, and meant it, but missing them and belonging with them, I was learning, were 2 very different things. The family photo on Sarah's mantle told the story they preferred to remember. There was Sarah in her wedding dress, radiant and perfect. David in his sharp suit, looking every inch the successful executive. Jake as a chubby-cheeked toddler, all innocent smiles and bright eyes, and tucked into the corner, almost as an afterthought. Was my teen years old, awkward in my ill-fitting suit? The black sheep even then. What the photo didn't show was the argument that had happened an hour before it was taken. Sarah pleading with me to just try to fit in for once. David making snide comments about my job prospects. Our parents, God, rest their souls, trying to keep the peace while secretly hoping I'd find my way to something respectable. The military had been my escape from all of that. In the Marines, I'd found purpose, brotherhood, a clear chain of command that made sense. I'd discovered I was good at things that mattered, keeping people alive, making split-second decisions under pressure. leading men through impossible situations. But now, sitting in Sarah's pristine living room with its white furniture and expensive artwork, those skills felt not just useless, but somehow embarrassing. "You know what your problem is?" David said one evening, settling into his leather recliner. "With a glass of wine? You're stuck in the past. The military thing was fine for a while, but now you need to think about the future." I was helping Jake with his homework at the kitchen table. Something about World War II that I actually knew something about. But David's words cut through the domestic scene like a blade. "The military thing," I repeated, not looking up from Jake's textbook. "You know what I mean? It's time to move on. Find a career, not just a job. Think about your legacy." Sarah shot him a warning look, but the damage was done. Legacy. As if 3 tours in Afghanistan. As if the lives I'd saved and the missions I'd completed. As if the brotherhood I'd forged with men who'd died for their country. As if none of that counted as legacy. Jake looked up from his homework, his young face serious. "Uncle Marcus, what was the most important thing you did in the Army?" "Marines," I corrected automatically. "I kept people safe. That was the job." "But anyone can do that," David interjected. "Security guards, police officers, not like—" "This," I said quietly, not where I was. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, the sound of dishes clattering filling the void. David went back to his wine and his phone, probably checking stock prices or responding to emails from his corner office downtown. But Jake kept looking at me with those curious eyes, and I realized he was the only one who seemed to understand that what I'd done mattered, not because it was glamorous or profitable, but because it was necessary. "Tell me about keeping people safe," he said, ignoring his father's disapproving look. I could have told him about the convoy we'd saved from an IED, or the village we'd protected from insurgents, or the night we'd held a position for 14 hours while medics evacuated wounded civilians. Instead, I just smiled and ruffled his hair. "Maybe another time, kiddo." Because I was learning that in this house, in this family, those stories weren't welcome. They were reminders of a world that made everyone uncomfortable, a world that didn't fit into their neat suburban narrative. I was supposed to be grateful for their tolerance, their willingness to let me crash in their guest room while I got back on my feet. But the truth was, I'd never felt more sure of my footing than I had in the desert. It was here, in this perfect house with its perfect family, that I felt like I was constantly falling. The worst part was watching Jake absorb it all. At 15, he was old enough to understand the undercurrents, to see how his parents talked about me when they thought I wasn't listening. He was learning that military service was something to be politely acknowledged and then forgotten, like a childhood hobby that you'd outgrown. I caught him sometimes, looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and confusion, as if he was trying to reconcile the uncle who'd served overseas with the family disappointment, who couldn't seem to find his place in the civilian world. And I realized that maybe the most damage wasn't being done to MIT, was being done to him. Teaching him that service and sacrifice were somehow less valuable than profit margins and career advancement. But I stayed quiet, because I didn't want to cause more problems, because I was grateful for the roof over my head and the chance to figure things out, because I still believed that family was family, even when they made it clear that you didn't quite belong. The dinner invitation came on a Tuesday, delivered with Sarah's trademark forced cheerfulness. "Just family," she said, which I'd learned meant David would be holding court, while I was expected to nod and smile and pretend his opinions mattered more than they did. The dining room table was set with Sarah's good china. It's a kind that came out for special occasions and visiting relatives. I took my usual seat at the far end, close enough to be included but far enough away to be ignored when convenient. Jake sat across from me, already looking uncomfortable in his button-down shirt and tie. David was in his element, talking about his latest business deal, while Sarah served a roast that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. He had that particular brand of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested, never having had to make decisions when lives hung in the balance. "So Marcus," David said, cutting into his meat with surgical precision, "Sarah tells Mio's still looking for the right opportunity. The right opportunity. Code for a job that would meet their standards. Something respectable that they could mention to their friends without embarrassment." "I'm being selective," I said, which was true enough. The warehouse job I'd taken was honest work, but it wasn't the kind of thing that impressed people at dinner parties. "That's wise," David nodded, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "You have to think long-term, build something. Your military experience is all well and good, but in the real world, You need practical skills. Jake looked up from his plate, his fork halfway to his mouth. What do you mean, practical skills? Well, David settled back in his chair, warming. To his favorite topic, your uncle's combat experience is largely irrelevant to civilian life. I mean, when was the last time you needed to, storm a building in downtown LA? The word hit me like a physical blow. Irrelevant. 3 tours of duty. Countless missions. The lives I'd saved and the sacrifices I'd made, all of it, dismissed with a single word. Sarah shot her husband a warning look.
8.
But he was too caught up in his own wisdom to notice. I'm not saying it wasn't important over there, David continued, reaching for his wine glass. But here in the real world, employers want to see practical experience. Sales, management, technical skills. Not. He waved his hand vaguely in my direction. Whatever it is you did over there. Hey. The silence stretched across the table like a minefield. I could feel Jake's eyes on me, waiting to see how I'd respond. Sarah was studying her plate as if the pattern on her china held the secrets of the universe. You're right, I said finally, my voice carefully neutral. Fighting insurgents and keeping supply lines open and training local forces, none of that translates to the real world. David missed the edge in my voice entirely. Exactly. You get it? That's why you need to focus on developing relevant skills. What about leadership? Jake asked suddenly, his voice louder than necessary. Uncle Marcus led people right. Isn't that relevant? David's smile was condescending. Military leadership is different, Jake. It's about following orders, not making independent decisions. In business, you need to think creatively, adapt to changing circumstances. You mean like adapting to IEDs and sniper fire? I interrupted, finally looking up from my plate. Or thinking creatively about how to evacuate civilians from a combat zone. That's not the same thing, David said, but some of his certainty had wavered. You're right, I said, standing up slowly. It's not the same thing. It's a hell of a lot harder. Sarah reached out as if to stop me, but I was already moving toward the door. Marcus, please, thanks for dinner, I said without turning around. I'll try to develop some relevant skills. I heard Jake's chair scrape against the floor as he started to follow me. But Sarah's sharp Jake, sit down, stopped him cold. Didn't look back as I walked out of the dining room, past the family photo on the mantel, past the perfectly arranged life that had no place for someone like me, outside. The California evening was warm and still, nothing like the desert nights I'd grown used to. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, looking back at the house with its golden windows and perfect facade. Inside, they were probably already moving on, David explaining to Jake why his uncle was being unreasonable, Sarah making excuses for everyone. But I could still see Jake's face across the dinner table. The way his eyes had flashed with something like anger when David dismissed my service. Maybe I wasn't the only one who'd heard the word irrelevant for what it really was. Judgment not just on my military experience, but on me as a person. The drive back to my apartment was quiet, the radio playing some forgettable pop song. That felt like it belonged to a different world. I thought about the men I'd served with, the ones who'd made it home and the ones who hadn't. I wondered what they'd think of David's assessment of our irrelevant experience. But mostly, I thought about Jake and the look in his eyes when he'd asked about leadership. He was the only one who seemed to understand that what I'd done mattered. Even if the rest of the family had already moved on to more important things, I didn't know it then. But that dinner was the beginning of the end of my attempts to fit into their world, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something else entirely. Jake started texting me more after that dinner, not about homework or family stuff, but questions that came at odd hours late at night or early in the morning when his parents were asleep or at work. Questions about what it felt like to be in a place where people didn't understand you, about making decisions when you weren't sure what the right answer was. I should have recognized the signs earlier. The way he'd grown quiet during family dinners, the new friends his parents mentioned but never seemed to meet, the phone calls that ended abruptly when adults entered the room, the way he'd started asking for rides to places he'd never shown interest in before. Uncle Marcus, he texted me one Tuesday evening. Do you ever miss the guys you served with? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Every day. Why? Just wondering what it's like to have friends who really get you. The answer hit me harder than I expected. Jake was 15, navigating high school and family expectations, and the particular pressure that came with being David's son. Perfect grades, perfect behavior, perfect future mapped out in advance, but somewhere in that perfect life, he was struggling with the same sense of not belonging that I'd carried home from overseas. The burner phone fell out of his backpack on a Saturday when I was giving him a ride to what he said was a study group. It clattered onto the floor of my truck, and Jake dove for it with the kind of panic that told me everything I needed to know. "Jake, not what you think," he said, clutching the phone like it was a lifeline. "What do I think?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the suburban streets that had shaped his entire world. "You think I'm getting into trouble?" Another silence. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, "I don't know." I pulled over into a parking lot, the engine ticking as it cooled. Jake was still holding the phone, his knuckles white with tension. "You want to tell me about it?" He shook his head, but then, the words came anyway, like water breaking through a dam. "There are these guys at school, older guys, seniors. They think I'm cool because my dad has money, and my mom drives a nice car. They invite me to stuff, and I know it's not really about me, but it feels good to be wanted. Yeah." Looked at me with surprise, as if he hadn't expected me to understand. "They have these parties, and everyone acts like I'm really part of the group, like I belong." I thought about the brotherhood I'd found in the Marines, the way it felt to be part of something bigger than yourself. But I also thought about the predators who lurked around military bases, looking for young soldiers with more money than sense. "What kind of parties?" Jake's grip on the phone tightened. "It's just normal stuff. Music, hanging out, some drinking, but not like crazy or anything." "In the phone?" "They said it was better to keep some things private, so parents don't worry about stupid stuff." The phone was cheap, the kind you could buy at any convenience store with cash, the kind people used when they didn't want their activities tracked or traced. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the same feeling I'd gotten in Afghanistan when something was about to go very wrong. "Hey, look at me." I turned, and I saw so much of myself in his eyes, the desperate need to belong, the willingness to overlook red flags if it meant being accepted. "These older guys, they ask you to do things, carry things, deliver messages." "Nothing bad," he said quickly. "Just small stuff. They say they trust me." Trust. The word every recruiter and predator used to make their targets feel special. I'd seen it overseas, the way insurgents would target young men who felt overlooked or undervalued. Offer purpose and belonging in exchange for small favors that grew larger over time. "What does your dad think about your new friends?" Jake's laugh was bitter. "He thinks I'm finally making the right connections. He says it's good for me to network with successful families." Of course he did. David saw everything through the lens of social climbing and business opportunities. He probably thought Jake was building relationships that would benefit him later, never considering that 15-year-old boys didn't get invited to parties by 18-year-old boys without a reason. "Jake, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Whatever these guys are asking you to do, whatever they're offering you, it's not about friendship. It's about using you." "You don't understand," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I understand better than you think. I've seen what happens when people who should know better take advantage of someone who just wants to belong." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken truths filling the space between us. Finally, Jake spoke again. "What if I stop hanging out with them, and nobody else wants to be my friend?" It was such a young question, so heartbreakingly honest, that I had to take a moment before answering. "Then you'll find out who your real friends are, and you'll learn that being alone is better than being used." Jake nodded, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. The rational part of him knew I was right, but the part that craved acceptance was still winning. I made a mental note to keep a closer eye on him, to be the adult who actually paid attention to what was happening in his life. I didn't know it then, but that conversation in the parking lot was the last chance I'd have to steer him away from whatever was coming, because sometimes, no matter how hard you try to protect someone, they have to learn the hard way that not all friendships are worth the price you pay for them. The text messages started showing up at all hours. Not on Jake's regular phone that once stayed clean, full of conversations with family and the few genuine friends he'd managed to keep, but the burner phone buzzed constantly, and I could see the stress lines forming around his eyes every time it went off. "You okay, kiddo?" I asked him one afternoon when I'd stopped by Sarah's house to return a tool I'd borrowed. He was sitting at the kitchen counter, supposedly doing homework, but his attention kept drifting to the phone beside his textbook. "Fine," he said automatically, but his leg was bouncing under the counter in a nervous rhythm I recognized from my own bad days. Sarah breezed through the kitchen, her arms full of dry cleaning. "How's the studying going, honey?" "Good," Jake replied, quickly sliding the phone under his history book. "Just working on this project." I watched the exchange with growing unease. Jake was getting better at lying, smoother at covering his tracks. In the military, we'd learned to recognize when someone was operating under stress. When the careful facades were starting to crack, all the signs were there: the hypervigilance, the carefully controlled responses, the way he checked his phone compulsively when he thought no one was watching. "Maybe you should take a break," I suggested. "Want to grab some lunch?" Jake glanced at his phone, then back at me. "I can't. I have plans later." "What kind of plans? Just hanging out with friends?" Sarah looked up from sorting through mail. "Those new friends from school? That's wonderful, Jake. Your father and I are so pleased you're expanding your social circle." I bit back my response. David and Sarah were so focused on the idea of Jake making connections with the right people that they'd stopped paying attention to what those connections actually involved. They saw expensive cars picking him up and designer clothes appearing in his closet, and they assumed it was all evidence of their son's social success. "Which friends?" I asked casually. Jake's jaw tightened. "You don't know them? Try me." "Marcus," Sarah interrupted. "You're being a bit intense, don't you think? Jake's 15. He's allowed to have friends without submitting a full report." But I'd seen the way Jake flinched when his phone buzzed, the way he'd started jumping at sudden noises. I'd watched him lose weight over the past month, seen the dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant anxiety. "I'm just interested," I said, keeping my voice level. "Maybe I could meet them sometime." "That's not necessary," Jake said quickly. "They're not really the type of people they're different from military guys." "Different." Word carried. Wait, an implication that my instincts were outdated, irrelevant to his teenage social world? But my instincts were screaming that something was wrong, that the boy sitting across from me was in over his head and either couldn't or wouldn't ask for help. That evening, I called Sarah. "I'm worried about Jake," I said without preamble. "What? Do you mean he's acting strange? Nervous? Secretive? I think these new friends might be bad news." Sarah's sigh was audible through the phone. "Marcus, I appreciate your concern, but Jake is fine. He's just growing up, becoming more independent. Maybe you're not used to normal teenage behavior." Normal teenage behavior. As if my military experience had somehow made me incapable of understanding adolescent development. As if the hypervigilance and anxiety I'd recognized in Jake were just typical growing pains. "Has he seemed different to you? More stressed?" "He's in high school, Marcus. Of course he's stressed. He's got grades to maintain, college applications to think about. This is a crucial time for him." I tried a different approach. "Have you met any of these new friends? Talked to their parents?" "David has. He's very impressed with the families Jake's connecting with. These are successful people, Marcus. The kind of connections that will benefit Jake in the long run." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but I could tell I was getting nowhere. Sarah and David were so invested in the idea of Jake's social advancement that they'd convinced themselves everything was fine. They were seeing what they wanted to see, ignoring the warning signs that were obvious to anyone who bothered to look. After I hung up, sat in my small apartment, staring at the phone and feeling the familiar frustration of being dismissed by people who should have known better. In Afghanistan, when we'd received intelligence about a potential threat, we'd investigated. We'd taken precautions. We'd acted on incomplete information because the cost of being wrong was too high. But here, in the safety of suburban California, my concerns were being written off as paranoia. My military-trained instincts were seen as a liability rather than an asset. I was being told to back off, to let Jake handle his own problems, to trust that everything would work out fine. The problem was, I'd seen what happened when good people ignored warning signs. I'd been to too many memorial services written to. Many letters to families who'd lost someone because threats weren't taken seriously until it was too late. Jake's phone buzzed again that night. I could see the blue glow from his bedroom window as I sat in my truck outside the house. To shake the feeling that I was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion, the boy I'd grown to care about was walking into something dangerous. The adults who should have been protecting him were too. Busy congratulating themselves on his social success to notice that their son was drowning right in front of them, the invitation came disguised as a study group. Jake mentioned it casually over dinner at Sarah's house, his tone carefully neutral as he explained that some friends were getting together to work on a history project about the Cold War. "It's at Brandon's house," he said, cutting his chicken. into precise pieces. His parents are out of town, so we'll have the whole place to ourselves to really focus. David nodded approvingly. Brandon Mitchell, right? His father's in commercial real estate? Good family. Sarah beamed. I think it's wonderful that you're taking your studies so seriously. What time should we pick you up? Actually, someone can give me a ride home. No need to come out late. I watched the exchange from across the table, noting the practiced way Jake delivered his lines. He'd clearly rehearsed this conversation, anticipated the questions his parents would ask, and prepared acceptable answers. The problem was, I'd heard similar conversations in Afghanistan from local informants who were playing multiple sides, feeding us information while secretly working with insurgents. Who's in this study group? I asked. Jake's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Just some kids from AP History. You don't know them. Try me. Marcus, Sarah intervened. Let the boy eat his dinner. You're being awfully suspicious about a study group. But I'd seen the invitation Jake had left on the counter while he was in the bathroom. Glossy card with gold lettering that looked more like a nightclub promotion than a homework session. The address was in the Hollywood Hills, the kind of place where houses cost more than most people made in a lifetime. What's the project about? I pressed. The Cuban Missile Crisis, Jake said without hesitation. We're doing a presentation on Kennedy's decision-making process. The answer came too quickly, too smoothly. Jake had always been a good student, but he'd never shown particular interest in presidential history. And I'd noticed his real textbooks hadn't moved from his bedroom in weeks. Sounds interesting, I said, keeping my voice casual. Maybe I could help. I actually know something about military strategy. That's not necessary, Jake said quickly. We've got it covered. After dinner, I lingered while Jake went upstairs to get ready. Sarah was loading the dishwasher with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. You're worried about something, she said without looking up. Aren't you? She paused, a plate halfway to the rack. Should I be? Jake's been different lately. More secretive, more stressed. This study group thing, does it seem right to you? Sarah dried her hands on a kitchen towel, her expression carefully neutral. Jake is 15, Marcus. He's supposed to be pulling away from family, forming his own identity. This is normal adolescent behavior. Normal adolescent behavior doesn't usually involve burner phones and secret meetings. What burner phone? Sarah's voice sharpened. I realized I'd said too much. Jake hadn't told his parents about the second phone, and revealing it now would break whatever fragile trust we'd built. I just meant he's been secretive about his communications, protective of his privacy in ways that seem excessive. He's a teenager. Privacy is important to them. We stood in silence for a moment, the dishwasher humming between us. Sarah wanted to believe everything was fine, and I couldn't blame her. It was easier to trust that your child was making good choices than to confront the possibility that something was going wrong. I could drive him tonight, I offered. Make sure he gets there safely. That's not necessary. His friends are picking him up. What friends? The ones from the study group. We were talking in circles, and I could see the conversation was over. Sarah had made her decision to trust Jake's version of events, and my concerns were just paranoid. Noise from someone who'd spent too much time in war zones. Jake came downstairs 20 minutes later, dressed in clothes I didn't recognize, expensive jeans, and a designer shirt that probably cost more than I made in a week. His hair was carefully styled, and he smelled like cologne. Lot of effort for a study group, I observed. I want to make a good impression. On who? Jake's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with poorly concealed relief. My ride's here. I should go. Through the window, I watched a black BMW pull into the driveway. The driver stayed behind the wheel, windows tinted dark enough that I couldn't see inside. Jake grabbed his backpack, which looked suspiciously light for someone carrying. Textbooks and headed for the door. Have fun studying, I called after him. He paused at the door, looking back at me with something that might have been regret. Thanks, Uncle Marcus. And then he was gone, climbing into the BMW and disappearing into the night. I stood at the window watching the taillights fade, that familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. I'll be fine, Sarah said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Yeah, I agreed, though we both knew I didn't believe it. I stayed at the house for another hour, helping Sarah clean up and making small talk with David about work and the weather. But my mind was elsewhere, running through scenarios and probabilities, calculating risks and potential outcomes. The invitation on the counter had disappeared. It was taken by Jake or hidden somewhere I couldn't find it. As I drove home, I made a decision that would have been automatic in Afghanistan, but felt like a betrayal. Here in the suburbs, I was going to follow up on my instincts, regardless of what my family thought about it. Because sometimes the people you care about most are the ones least likely to listen when you try to warn them about danger. And sometimes, being right about something terrible is worse than being wrong about it. I sat in my truck outside the house in the Hollywood Hills for 20 minutes before I saw the first sign of trouble. The address Jake had given his parents was real enough. A sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion with a circular driveway and enough outdoor lighting to illuminate a small airport. But the cars parked outside weren't driven by high school students. Through my military-issue binoculars, I could see license plates from Nevada, Arizona, even one from Mexico. The vehicles were expensive but not flashy, the kind of cars that belonged to people who had money but didn't want to advertise it. A black Escalade with tinted windows sat near the front entrance, engine running despite the warm night. The music was loud enough to carry across the street, but it wasn't the kind of music teenagers played at house parties. This was deliberate. Designed to mask conversations and other sounds, I'd heard similar tactics used in Afghanistan, where insurgents would blast music to cover the noise of weapons being moved or meetings being held. I adjusted the binoculars and scanned the visible windows. The house was full of people, but from what I could see, most of them were adults. Men in expensive suits, women in designer dresses, everyone moving with the kind of purpose that suggested this wasn't a social gathering. Then I saw Jake. He was standing near a window on the second floor, still wearing the clothes he'd left home in, but his body language had changed completely. The confident teenager who'd walked out of his parents' house was gone, replaced by someone who looked very young and very scared. He was talking to a man I couldn't see clearly, nodding rapidly in the way people do when they're trying to please someone they're afraid of. I lowered the binoculars and checked my watch. Jake had been inside for less than an hour, but already something had shifted. The boy who'd been so eager to impress his new friends was now clearly in over his head. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Hope Jake's study group is going well. Don't wait up for him," he said. "He might be late." I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Sounds good. Tell him to be careful." But careful was exactly what Jake wasn't being. From my vantage point across the street, I could see him being led from room to room, introduced to people who looked at him with the kind of interest that made my skin crawl. These weren't teenagers working on a history project. These were adults who'd found a use for a naive 15-year-old with wealthy parents and no supervision. A car pulled up behind me. I tensed automatically before recognizing it as just another party guest. But the driver stayed in his seat for several minutes, talking on his phone and checking his mirrors in a way that suggested he was coordinating with someone else. When he finally got out, he walked with the measured pace of someone who'd been in the military or law enforcement. I was trained to recognize patterns, to piece together incomplete information, and draw logical conclusions. What I was seeing wasn't a teenage party or even a wild adult gathering. It was something more organized, more purposeful. It's the kind of event where young people like Jake were brought in to serve specific functions, as couriers, as covers, as expendable assets who could be easily discarded if things went wrong. My phone rang, and I answered without taking my eyes off the house. "What?" "Marcus, it's Jake." His voice was barely above a whisper, and I could hear anxiety in every syllable. "Where are you?" "I'm at the study group, but I think I made a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" "These people, they're not what I thought they were. Hey, asking me to do things, and I don't know how to say no without making them angry." I started my truck's engine. "Where exactly are you?" "I can't. They told me not to use my regular phone. I'm calling from a bathroom, and I don't think I have much time." "Jake, listen to me very carefully. Do not do anything they ask you to. Do not take anything they give you. Do not go anywhere with them. Just find a way to stall until I can get there." "You don't understand," he said, and I could hear the fear in his voice now. "They know things about me, about my family. They know where I live, where I go to school. They're not just asking, they're telling." The line went dead. I stared at my phone for 3 seconds, then made a decision that would either save Jake or destroy what was left of my relationship with my family. I dialed 911. "I need to report a minor in danger," I said when the operator answered. "Wait, 15-year-old boy, possibly being coerced at a party in the Hollywood Hills?" The operator took the address and promised to send units to investigate, but I knew it would take time. Jake didn't have time. Whatever was happening inside that house was escalating, and a scared 15-year-old was about to become a casualty of his own naive trust. I got out of my truck and walked closer to the house, using the shadows and my Military training to stay hidden while I assessed the situation. The front entrance was clearly out to many people, too much visibility. But houses like this always had multiple access points, service entrances that rich people use to keep their staff invisible. Moving around to the side of the property, found what I was looking for. A gate leading to the service area, probably used by catering companies and cleaning crews. It was locked, but it was also the kind of lock that could be bypassed if you knew what you were doing and weren't concerned about property damage. Inside the gate, I could see the layout more clearly. The house had multiple levels built into the hillside, with terraces and outdoor spaces that provided cover and concealment. More importantly, I could see the security arrangements cameras at obvious choke points, but blind spots where someone who knew how to move tactically could avoid detection. I wasn't planning to storm the building. I wasn't planning to start a firefight in the Hollywood Hills, but I was planning to extract one scared teenager from a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond his control. And I was prepared to use whatever force was necessary to make that happen. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from an unknown number. Your nephew is fine. He's learning about real opportunities. Don't interfere. The message told me several things. First, they knew I was here, which meant they had lookouts or better surveillance than I had initially assessed. Second, they knew who I was and who Jake was to me, which meant this wasn't random. They had done their research. Third, they were confident, enough to threaten me directly, which suggested they had resources and weren't worried about law enforcement. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed that threatening someone with military training would make them back down. They'd confused civilian rules of engagement with combat rules of engagement. In the civilian world, you called the police and waited for help. In combat, you adapted to the situation and accomplished the mission using whatever means were available. I texted back, Jake comes out now, or I come in. Your choice. The response was immediate. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Walk away. I looked up at the house, counting visible occupants and calculating odds. They were right about being outnumbered, but they were wrong about being outgunned, because they were thinking in terms of weapons. I was thinking in terms of training, experience, the absolute certainty that I would not leave a 15-year-old boy in the hands of people who communicated through threats. The sound of sirens in the distance told me the cavalry was finally coming, but it also told me that whatever was going to happen needed to happen soon. In a few minutes, this would become a police matter, with all the complications and delays that entailed. Jake might disappear into the system, or worse, disappear entirely. I checked my watch and made final preparations. In Afghanistan, we'd called it going loud, the moment when stealth and patience gave way to decisive action. I'd hoped to avoid that here, in this suburban paradise where problems were supposed to be solved with phone calls and reasonable conversations, but sometimes it's the only way to protect someone is to remind the world that there are still people willing to fight for what's right, even when the odds are against them. Even when the people you're protecting don't understand the cost of that protection until it's too late. The pills spilled across the marble floor like deadly confetti, small white tablets that could have been anything from painkillers to something far more dangerous. Jake stood frozen in the center of the chaos, his face pale as the man in the expensive suit grabbed his shirt and pulled him close. Pick them up, the man snarled, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of being obeyed without question. Every single one. I was crouched behind a planter on the terrace, close enough to hear the conversation through the open sliding door, but still hidden from the main party. The sirens were getting closer, maybe 5 minutes out, but Jake didn't have 5 minutes. Scene inside was a masterclass in manipulation and control. Jake had been brought here under false pretenses, drawn in by the promise of acceptance and belonging, only to find himself trapped in a situation that had nothing to do with friendship and everything to do with exploitation. The study group had been a recruitment operation designed to identify and compromise vulnerable teenagers from wealthy families. I can't, Jake whispered, his voice shaking. I don't want to do this anymore. The man's grip tightened. You don't have a choice. You took our money. You ate our food. You accepted our hospitality. Now you pay it back. Around them, the party continued with the practiced normalcy of people who'd done this before. Adults in expensive clothing drank expensive wine and made expensive small talk while a 15-year-old boy was being coerced into criminal activity in the next room. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, a veneer of respectability covering something rotten at its core. Jake bent down slowly. his hands shaking as he began gathering the scattered pills. Each tablet he picked up was another step deeper into a world he'd never asked to enter, another compromise that would be harder to explain later. I could see the calculations running through his mind: how to get out, how to explain this to his parents, how to pretend none of this had ever happened. "That's better," the man said, loosening his grip, but not releasing Jake entirely. "You're learning. This is what real life looks like, kid, not the fairy tale your parents sold you." Another man approached, this one younger but no less dangerous. "Police scanner says units are responding to this address. Someone called in a disturbance." "Duh." First man's expression darkened. "Search the perimeter. If we have uninvited guests, I want to know about it." I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, weighing my options. The smart play was to wait for law enforcement, let them handle the situation through proper channels, but Jake was deteriorating. By the minute, psychological state fragile enough that permanent damage was being done, regardless of the eventual outcome. The younger man stepped onto the terrace, scanning the darkness with the practiced eye of someone who'd done security work before. He was carrying something in his jacket, not necessarily a weapon, but definitely something he was prepared to use. When his gaze swept past my hiding spot, I held my breath and remained perfectly still. "Clear out here," he called back to the house, "but keep the kid close. He's our insurance if this goes sideways." Insurance. Jake had gone from guest to victim to human shield in the span of a few hours, and he probably didn't even understand the progression. He was still thinking in terms of teenage social dynamics, still believing that cooperation would somehow earn him a way out of this situation. The man with the pills completed his count and nodded approvingly. "Good boy. Now here's what's going to happen next. You're going to take these to a location we'll give you tomorrow. A simple delivery, nothing more. And then you're going to forget this night ever happened. What if I say no?" The man smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen. "Then we share some very interesting photos with your parents and your school. And maybe a few other people who'd be fascinated to know about your recreational activities." Photos. They'd been documenting Jake's time here, creating leverage for future manipulation. This wasn't just about one night or one favor. It was about long-term control, turning a naive 15-year-old into a permanent asset. Jake's shoulders sagged in defeat, and I realized we'd reached the point of no return. Whatever happened next would define not just his immediate future, but his understanding of how the world really worked. He could learn that predators always won, that the powerful always exploited the vulnerable, that good people stood by and watched while bad things happened to children. Or he could learn that sometimes, when the system failed and the adults looked the other way, there were still people willing to fight back. I checked my gear one final time and prepared to remind everyone in that house why my combat experience wasn't quite as irrelevant as they'd assumed. The pills scattered across the floor were about to become the least of their problems, because Jake was about to discover that having an uncle who'd spent 3 tours in Afghanistan came with certain advantages that his new friends hadn't factored into their carefully laid plans. And I was about to show them exactly what irrelevant military training looked like when, applied to a real-world situation, the sirens were still 3 minutes out. That would have to be enough. The field manual I'd memorized in Kandahar had a section on urban, close-quarters operations that I'd never expected to use in Beverly Hills. But as I crouched in the shadows outside that mansion, every lesson came flooding back with crystalline clarity. Assess the threat. Identify escape routes. Minimize collateral damage. Accomplish the mission. The mission was simple. Extract one 15-year-old from a hostile environment without anyone getting hurt. The complications were everything else. I counted at least 15 adults inside the house, not including the security personnel who were now actively searching for whoever had called the police. The good news was that they were operating under some civilian rules of engagement. They couldn't simply eliminate witnesses or burn evidence without creating bigger problems for themselves. The bad news was that Jake was caught in the middle, and scared people make unpredictable decisions. Through the sliding door, I watched the man with the pills grow increasingly agitated as the sirens drew closer. He was checking his phone repeatedly, issuing rapid-fire instructions to people I couldn't see. This wasn't his first time dealing with law enforcement, but something about the situation was making him nervous. "Change of plans," he announced to the room. "We're moving the kid now." Jake looked up from where he'd been sitting on a white leather couch, still clutching the small bag of pills they'd forced him to collect. "Moving me where? Somewhere safe?" Somewhere you can think about your choices without interference? Words sent ice through my veins. In military terms, they were talking about relocating a valuable asset to a more secure location. In human terms, they're about to kidnap a 15-year-old boy and take him somewhere his family would never find him. I had maybe 60 seconds before they moved Jake to a vehicle, at which point this would become a mobile situation requiring entirely different tactics. 60 seconds to neutralize multiple threats, secure my nephew, and create enough chaos to cover our escape. The mental calculations were automatic. Muscle memory from 1,000 training exercises and a dozen real operations. Primary target, the man controlling Jake. Secondary targets, anyone blocking the exit routes. Tertiary concern, preserve evidence for law enforcement while ensuring no one could destroy it after we left. I pulled out my phone and sent a quick text to 911 dispatch. Officer needs assistance. Armed suspects holding minor against will. Suspect vehicle preparing to leave scene. Request immediate response. It wasn't entirely true. I wasn't an officer, and I hadn't confirmed weapons, but it would ensure maximum police response and minimal questions about my presence here. The younger security man stepped back onto the terrace, this time carrying what was definitely a pistol and a shoulder holster. He was scanning more systematically now, using a small flashlight to check the shadows. Where I was hiding? It's found tire tracks? He called back to the house. Someone's been watching us. How long? Hard to say. At least an hour, maybe more. An hour. They knew I'd been conducting surveillance, which meant they'd upgrade their threat assessment and take additional precautions. But it also meant they were rattled, operating outside their comfort zone and making decisions based on incomplete information. The man with the pills appeared in the doorway, Jake beside him with the defeated posture of someone who'd given up. Hope of rescue. Bring the car around. We're leaving. What about the party? Let them handle the police. We've got bigger concerns. This was it. Once they got Jake into a vehicle, my window of opportunity would close permanently. I'd go from having tactical advantage knowing the terrain and controlling the timing to playing catch-up on unfamiliar ground with unknown resources. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the tactical knife I'd carried since Afghanistan. Not to hurt anyone, but because sometimes the sight of serious steel was enough to change people's decision-making process. Sometimes, the difference between a victim and a survivor was the willingness to escalate beyond what your opponents expected. The security man was 3 feet away now, his flashlight beam sweeping methodically across the area where I was concealed. In another few seconds, he'd spot me, and the element of surprise would be gone. But surprise was only one advantage. I'd learned to fight without it when necessary. The real advantage was experience knowing how to move efficiently in high-stress situations, how to read people's intentions from their body language, how to make split-second decisions when multiple lives hung in the balance. Jake appeared. In the doorway again, this time with his hands zip-tied behind his back. The sight hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just moving him, they were treating him like a prisoner. It's like enemy personnel rather than a confused teenager who'd made some bad choices. The transformation was complete. Jake had gone from willing participant to coerced accomplice. Too captive, and the adults responsible were preparing to disappear him into a system that specialized in making inconvenient people vanish permanently. I thought about David's words at that dinner table, about my combat experience being irrelevant to the real world, about how civilian skills were more valuable than military training, how violence was never the answer to complex problems. But looking at my nephew's bit-tied and terrified and about to disappear into a nightmare, I realized that sometimes the real world was exactly like a combat zone. Sometimes the only thing standing between innocence and predation was someone willing to fight back with everything they had. The security man's flashlight beam was inches from my position. In 30 seconds, Jake would be in a car and gone forever. The sirens were still 2 minutes out, which might as well have been 2 hours. Time to show everyone exactly how relevant 3 tours in Afghanistan could be. When applied to protecting family, I moved like smoke and struck like lightning. The security man never saw me coming. One moment he was scanning the shadows with his flashlight, the next he was on the ground with my arm around his throat and his weapon secured. 3 seconds of controlled pressure to the carotid artery, and he was unconscious without a sound. His radio and keys went into my pocket. His zip ties became my tools. Jake, I called softly through the sliding door. When I say run, you head straight for the gate we came in through. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything. The man holding my nephew spun around, his face shifting from confusion to recognition to something approaching fear. "You're the uncle? I'm the uncle." Jake's eyes went wide when he saw me, relief and terror warring across his features. The zip ties around his wrists were standard law enforcement issue, the kind that required a knife or specialized tool to remove safely. "This is a private party," the man said, his voice steady despite the tactical knife in my hand and the unconscious security guard at my feet. "You're trespassing. You're holding a minor against his will. I'd say we're both having a bad night." The party had gone quiet behind him. Expensive people and expensive clothes. We're suddenly faced with a situation that couldn't be solved with money or lawyers or polite conversation. Some were already moving toward exits, unwilling to be present when things turned serious. "Let him go," I said, stepping into the light where everyone could see me clearly, right now, and nobody gets hurt. "I don't think you understand the situation." "I understand it perfectly. You recruited a 15-year-old for criminal activity, documented it for blackmail purposes, and now you're trying to relocate him before law enforcement arrives. What I don't understand is why you think I'm going to let that happen." The man's hand moved toward his jacket, and I shifted my weight forward, ready to close the distance between us. But he was smart enough to recognize the look in my eyes. Absolute certainty that if he drew a weapon, I would take it away from him and use it to redecorate his expensive house. "You're outnumbered," he said instead. "I'm experienced." There's a difference. Around us, the beautiful people were discovering that their careful world of privilege and protection had limits. When someone with nothing to lose and everything to fight for decided to stop playing by civilized rules, all their advantages became irrelevant. "Jake," I said without taking my eyes off the man. "Are you hurt?" "No, Uncle Marcus. But I can't. My hands, I know. Just stay calm." I pulled the radio from my pocket and changed the frequency to the police channel I'd memorized earlier. "This is Marcus Rivera at 1247 Mulholland Drive. I have eyes on a minor being held against his will by multiple suspects, requesting immediate backup." The man's expression darkened. "Just made this a lot more complicated." "Good. Complicated means more witnesses, more evidence. More people who'll have to explain why they were at a party where teenagers were being coerced into drug trafficking." That hit home. Several more guests headed for the exits, unwilling to risk their reputations on whatever was about to happen. The smart ones were already calling their lawyers, preparing damage control for a situation that had spiraled far beyond their comfort zones. "What do you want?" the man asked. "I want him unharmed, unthreatened, and free to leave with me. I want the photos and videos you took deleted from every device in this house. And I want everyone here to remember that some families don't negotiate with predators." The sound of approaching sirens was getting louder, maybe 90 seconds out. Now, the man was calculating odds, weighing the cost of resistance against the certainty of police involvement. His carefully constructed operation was collapsing, and he had to decide whether Jake was worth fighting for. "He's in too deep," the man said finally. "Even if I let him go, what he's seen, what he knows, he's a liability now." "Then that's your problem, not his." I stepped closer, letting him see the absolute commitment in my face. In Afghanistan, we'd called it the look, the expression that told enemy combatants that negotiation was over and violence was imminent. It wasn't about threats or bravado. It was about demonstrating that you were prepared to go further than they were, to pay a higher price, to accept consequences they couldn't imagine. "Last chance," I said. "Cut him loose and walk away, or deal with the consequences of holding a child hostage when the police arrive." The man stared at me for a long moment, probably running through his options and finding them all unacceptable. Finally, he pulled a knife from his pocket and sliced through Jake's zip ties. "Go to your uncle," he said quietly. Jake stumbled toward me, his circulation returning to his hands in painful stages. When he reached me, I pulled him behind me, keeping my body between him and the room full of people who'd been perfectly willing to destroy his life for their own profit. "We're leaving," I announced to the room. "Nobody follows us. Nobody makes any calls. Nobody does anything stupid that would require me to come back and finish this conversation." The unconscious security guard was starting to stir, but he'd be disoriented for several more minutes. Long enough for us to reach safety, long enough for the police to arrive and sort out who was who and what was what. Jake walked slowly toward the gate. "Stay behind me. Keep your eyes forward. As we moved through the house, I could feel dozens of eyes tracking our progress. Wealthy, powerful people who'd never been challenged by someone, who didn't care about their money or their connections or their ability to make problems disappear. They were learning that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one with nothing left to lose. We reached the front door just as the first police cars turned onto the street, their red and blue lights painting the mansion in colors of justice and accountability. Jake was shaking beside me, adrenaline and relief hitting him in waves. "Uncle Marcus," he whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "We'll talk about it later," I said, putting my arm around his shoulders. "We just need to get you home. Safe." As we walked toward the police cars, I realized that David had been wrong about my combat experience being irrelevant. Tonight, it had been the most relevant thing in the world, the difference between a lost boy and a rescued nephew, between a family tragedy and a family salvation. Sometimes, the skills you hope you'll never need again are exactly the skills that save the people you love most. Jake's shirt was torn at the shoulder, a small detail that somehow made everything more real. We sat in the back of my truck in the police station parking lot at 2:17 a.m., waiting for the detectives to finish with their initial interviews and release us to go home. The torn fabric kept catching my eye, evidence of how close we'd come to losing him entirely. "They said they had pictures," Jake said suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between us for the past 10 minutes. His voice was hoarse from stress and exhaustion, but he needed to talk, needed to process what had happened before we faced his parents. "What kind of pictures?" "From earlier tonight, me holding the pills, me talking to those guys, me looking like I was part of it all." He pulled at the tear in his shirt unconsciously. "They said if I didn't cooperate, they'd send them to my parents, to my school, to college admissions offices when the time came." I felt that familiar surge of anger, the cold rage that had gotten me through some very dark places overseas. These people hadn't just threatened Jake, they'd crafted a long-term plan to control his entire future, to turn one night of poor judgment into a lifetime of coercion. "The police have their phones and cameras now," I said. "Everything's evidence. Nothing's getting sent anywhere." Jake nodded, but I could see he wasn't entirely convinced. When you're 15 and scared, it's hard to believe that adults can actually fix the problems other adults create. "How did you know?" he asked. "How did you know it wasn't really a study group?" I thought about how to answer that, how to explain the instincts that had been honed in places where trusting the wrong person could get you killed. "You were acting different, more stressed, more secretive." The burner phone was a red flag. "And tonight when you called me from that bathroom, the fear in your voice wasn't about being embarrassed or getting in trouble. It was the kind of fear that comes from realizing you're in real danger. I should have listened to you earlier, when you tried to warn me about these guys. You were 15 and wanted to belong somewhere. That's not a crime, Jake. They're the ones who took advantage of that." We sat in silence again, watching police officers move in and out of the station with the purposeful energy of people working. A major case. Through the windows, I could see Detective Morrison, the lead investigator, gesturing as he talked to someone on the phone, probably updating federal authorities, since the operation we'd stumbled into was clearly bigger than a local matter. "Uncle Marcus." "Yeah. When you were in Afghanistan, did you ever feel like you were in over your head? Like you'd made a mistake you couldn't take back?" The question hit deeper than he probably intended. I thought about convoy missions that had gone wrong, about decisions made with incomplete information, about nights when the weight of responsibility had felt crushing. More often than I'd like to admit, how did you handle it? I learned to focus on what I could control instead of what I couldn't. I couldn't take back the mistakes, but I could make better decisions going forward. I couldn't change the past, but I could influence the future. Jake picked at the torn fabric again, his young face serious in the fluorescent light from the parking lot. "I thought they were my friends. I thought they actually cared about me. They were good at making you think that. That's how predators work. They find what you need and pretend to offer it until you're too invested to walk away easily. But you walked away from stuff. In the military, I mean. You came home." I considered that, the comparison he was drawing between military service and his own situation. I came home because my tour was over and I'd completed my mission. But it took time to really leave it behind, to stop feeling like I was still fighting those battles. "Do you think I'll be able to leave this behind?" The question was loaded with more fear than a 15-year-old should have to carry. Jake was already worried about how this night would define him, how it would follow him through the rest of high school and into college and beyond. "I think you'll remember it," I said carefully, "but I also think you'll learn from it, and someday you might be able to help someone else who's in a similar situation, like you helped me, like you'll help someone else." Detective Morrison appeared at the truck window, tapping gently to get our attention. He was a career cop with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd seen enough family trauma to understand that solving the crime was only half the job. "We're ready to release you both," he said. "Jake, you did good tonight. Taking that call, trusting your uncle, giving us the information we needed, that took courage." Jake straightened slightly, some of the shame lifting from his shoulders. "What happens now?" "Now we build a case against the people who tried to hurt you. And you go home and try to get some sleep, because tomorrow is going to be a long day, with more questions and more statements." "What about my parents?" Detective Morrison looked at me, then back at Jake. "Your uncle called them. They're waiting at home, and they're very grateful that you're safe." As we drove through the empty streets toward Sarah's house, Jake stared out the window at the suburban landscape that had been his whole world until tonight. Everything looked the same, but I knew he was seeing it differently, now understanding that safety was more fragile than he'd realized, that the adults he'd trusted to protect him hadn't always been paying attention. "Jake," I said as we turned onto his street, "what happened tonight doesn't define you. The choices you make from here forward, those are what matter." He nodded, and in his profile I could see both the child he'd been and the young man he was becoming. The torn shirt would be thrown away, the physical evidence disposed of, but the lessons learned about trust and manipulation, about family and protection, about the difference between real friendship and predatory grooming, those would stay with him forever. And maybe, I thought as we pulled into his driveway, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. The police report Detective Morrison handed me the next morning was 12 pages of clinical language that somehow failed to capture the full horror of what Jake had walked into: organized drug distribution, money laundering, interstate trafficking. A dozen federal charges against people whose names appeared on charity boards and country club membership lists. "The operation you disrupted last night," Detective Morrison explained, as we sat in his office, "had been running for almost 2 years. They specifically targeted teenagers from wealthy families, gradually escalating their involvement until the kids were too compromised to back out." I scanned the report, noting the names and addresses of other victims. Kids from Beverly Hills, Manhattan Beach, Palos Verdes, the places where parents assumed their children were safe because they had money and good neighborhoods and strong schools. How many kids? 17 that we know of, probably more, who were too scared to come forward. Morrison leaned back in his chair, the weight of the investigation visible in his tired eyes. "Your nephew was lucky. Most of them were in much deeper before anyone noticed something was wrong." Lucky. Jake had been zip-tied and threatened with blackmail. But compared to the other cases Morrison described, he'd barely been touched by the operation that had destroyed so many other families. What happens to the other kids? Therapy, mostly. Legal immunity in exchange for testimony. Some of them will need years to recover from what was done to them. I thought about Jake, sitting at home with his parents, trying to explain how he'd been drawn into something that had seemed so innocent. At first, Sarah had called me an hour earlier, her voice shaky with gratitude and confusion. "We had no idea," she'd said. "We thought he was making friends, expanding his social circle. How could we have been so blind?" How indeed. I'd tried to warn them, tried to point out the changes in Jake's behavior, but they'd been so invested in his apparent social success that they'd ignored every red flag. Now they were dealing with the reality that their perfect suburban life had been an illusion, that predators could reach their children even in the best neighborhoods with the best schools and the best intentions. "There's something else," Morrison said, pulling out another folder. "The man who is controlling your nephew's Ensign, Reeves. He's been looking into your family for months. Background checks, financial records, detailed surveillance." He spread photographs across his desk, and I felt my blood chill. Pictures of Sarah's house, David's office, Jake walking to school. Pictures of me coming and going from my apartment, shopping at the grocery store, sitting alone at a coffee shop, reading the newspaper. "They knew about your military service," Morrison continued. "Reeves specifically told his people that you were a potential problem, someone who might interfere if you figured out what was happening. But they went after Jake anyway. They thought they could control the situation. Keep you in the dark. Move fast enough that you wouldn't have time to react. Morrison smiled grimly. They underestimated what 3 tours in Afghanistan teaches you about threat assessment. I studied the surveillance photos, noting the angles and timing. These people had been watching my family for months, mapping our routines and relationships, looking for vulnerabilities they could exploit. Jake's desire to fit in, David and Sarah's social ambitions, my own isolation from the family dynamic hit, had all been cataloged and weaponized. How did they know to target Jake specifically? Social media, school records, financial information. They built profiles on dozens of kids, looking for the right combination of wealth, family dysfunction, and emotional vulnerability. Family dysfunction. The phrase stung because it was accurate. Jake had been vulnerable precisely because he felt disconnected from his parents, dismissed by his father, pressured to be someone he wasn't sure he wanted to become. My own outsider status had made me a threat to their operation, but it had also meant that Jake didn't feel comfortable coming to me for help until it was almost too late. The burner phone we recovered from your nephew, Morrison said, pulling out an evidence bag, had over 300 messages from the last month. Gradual escalation, classic grooming patterns. They started with friendship and belonging, moved to small favors and gifts, then began introducing criminal elements as tests of loyalty. 300 messages. Jake had been receiving constant communication from these people, a steady stream of manipulation designed to isolate him from his family and bind him to their cause. While David and Sarah celebrated his newfound social connections, their son was being systematically recruited by criminals who saw him as nothing more than a useful asset. What's the timeline for prosecution? Federal charges will take months to develop fully. But the local case against Reeves should move quickly. Your nephew's testimony will be crucial, especially the recording of that phone call from the bathroom. Recording. I'd forgotten that 911 calls were automatically recorded, that Jake's terrified voice describing his situation would become evidence in court. How's he handling all this? Morrison's expression softened. Better than most. Having family who believed. Him who acted to protect him, that makes a difference. A lot of these kids suffer in silence because they're ashamed or scared or convinced that no one will help them. I thought about Jake's call from that bathroom, the way his voice had cracked when he'd admitted he was in trouble. If he hadn't trusted me enough to make that call, if I hadn't been positioned to respond immediately, the alternative didn't bear thinking about. Detective Morrison, I said, standing to leave when this goes to trial, when Jake has to testify, will make sure he's protected. Closed court, victim advocacy. The news article Jake found online was buried on page 3 of the Los Angeles Times business section. But the headline was enough to shake David's carefully constructed worldview. Federal drug ring. Targeted wealthy teens in multi-million-dollar operation. Jake printed it out and left it on the kitchen table where his parents would find it when they came home from their emergency session with a family therapist. I was there when they walked in, having been summoned for what Sarah called a family meeting to process recent events. David picked up the article first, his face going pale as he read the details of the investigation. Names of other families, descriptions of the recruitment tactics, federal charges that would put the perpetrators in prison for decades, and buried in the third paragraph, a reference to a teenage victim who was rescued by a family member with military training. This is about Jake, Sarah said, reading over his shoulder. This is about us, the reporter called this morning, Jake said quietly from his position at the counter. She wanted to interview me about what happened. I told her no, but she said other families are coming forward. Parents who ignored warning signs, kids who got in too deep to get out alone. David set the paper down carefully as if it might explode. How many other families? 17 confirmed victims, I said. Probably more who haven't admitted it yet. The silence stretched uncomfortably. David was doing the math, calculating. The odds that his son had been randomly targeted versus the possibility that their family had been specifically selected for reasons they'd preferred not to examine. The detective said they'd been watching us for months, Jake continued. They knew about Uncle Marcus's military service. They knew he might interfere if he'd figured out what was happening. But they targeted you anyway, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. They thought they could move fast enough, control the situation well enough that it wouldn't matter. Jake looked directly at his father. They underestimated what combat experience teaches you about protecting people. David flinched at the word combat, and I realized Jake was deliberately using language his father had dismissed just weeks earlier. The boy was making a point, forcing his parents to confront the contradiction between their dinner table dismissals and the reality of what had saved their son's life. "We need to talk about how this happened," Sarah said, settling into her chair with the careful movements of someone trying to maintain control. "How we missed so many warning signs. We didn't miss them," David said defensively. Marcus raised concerns and we listened. "No, Dad, you didn't listen. You dismissed Uncle Marcus's concerns as paranoia. You told me his combat experience was irrelevant to civilian life. You were so focused on my social advancement that you ignored everything that suggested I was in danger." The words hit David like physical blows. His carefully constructed narratives, sexful, businessman protecting his family through wealth and status, was crumbling in the face of evidence that his judgment had nearly cost his son everything. "I was trying to protect you," David said weakly. "From what? From having an uncle who'd actually learned how to recognize threats? From military training that teaches you to pay attention when something doesn't feel right?" I watched David struggle with the implications of Jake's words. For 3 years, he'd treated my military service as an embarrassing phase I needed to get over, a reminder of poor life choices that had no relevance to their sophisticated civilian world.
Ow.
His son was telling him that those same experiences had been the only thing standing between their family and disaster. The therapist said we need to examine our family communication patterns. Sarah interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "How we can better support each other going forward. I know how we can start," Jake said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "We can admit that Uncle Marcus was right about everything, can acknowledge that the military training Dad called irrelevant actually saved my life, and we can stop pretending that money and status are the same thing as actual protection." David's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "Jake, you don't understand the complexities. I understand that you were so impressed. Buy expensive cars and designer clothes that you never asked why. 18-year-old kids wanted to be friends with a 15-year-old. I understand that when Uncle Marcus tried to warn you, you told him he was being paranoid. I understand that if he hadn't followed his instincts and ignored your advice, I'd probably be dead or disappeared by now." The brutal honesty of Jake's words cut through years of careful family politeness. He was forcing his parents to confront not just what had happened, but their role in creating the conditions that had made it possible. "Your uncle did save you," Sarah said quietly. "And we're grateful, but we're also trying to understand how our family got to this point. We got here because you wanted me to fit in with the right people more than you wanted me to be safe," Jake said. "You were so focused on networking and social advancement that you stopped paying attention to who I actually was." I could see David building toward an explosion, his face reddening with the kind of anger that comes from being forced to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about yourself. "That's enough," he said sharply. "We made mistakes, yes, but we're not the villains." "Here, we're not the ones who know," Jake interrupted. "You're not villains, but you're not heroes either. Uncle Marcus is the hero. He's the one who saw danger when you saw opportunity. He's the one who acted when you wanted to wait and see. He's the one whose irrelevant combat experience turned out to be the most relevant thing in our family's life." David looked at me. For the first time since the conversation had started, and I could see the struggle in his eyes. Part of him wanted to maintain his position, to argue that his concerns about my military background had been legitimate. But a larger part was beginning to understand that his son was alive because someone in the family had refused to be civilized when civilization wasn't enough. "Marcus," he said finally, his voice strained, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. It wasn't much, but it was a start." And as I looked around the table at my damaged, complicated, imperfect family, I realized that sometimes the people who hurt you the most are also the ones most capable of learning from their mistakes. The question was whether David's apology would lead to real change, or whether this crisis would eventually fade into family history, leaving us right back where we'd started with me on the outside, looking in. The thank you letter arrived 3 days later, written in Jake's careful handwriting on school letterhead. He'd submitted it as an English assignment about gratitude, but his teacher had been so moved by it that she'd asked permission to share it with the school counselor, who'd shared it with the principal, who'd called Sarah to discuss Jake's remarkable resilience and mature perspective on his recent experiences. David found me reading it in Sarah's kitchen, where I'd been helping Jake with his geometry homework, something that had become a regular occurrence since the incident. "I never thanked you properly," David said, settling into the chair across from me, "for saving my son." I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "You don't need to thank me for protecting family. I do, though, 'cause you protected him. When I failed to, 'Cause you saw what I couldn't see, or wouldn't see? David's voice was steady, but I could hear the effort it was taking to maintain control. I've been thinking a lot about what I said at dinner, about your combat experience being irrelevant. People say things they don't mean when they're frustrated. No, Marcus, I meant it when I said it. It's what makes it worse. I genuinely believed that your military training was a liability, something that made you less suited for civilian life rather than more capable of handling complex situations. Through the kitchen window, I could see Jake in the backyard, throwing that tennis ball against the fence again. It had become his way of processing stress, a repetitive motion that helped him think through complicated emotions. What changed your mind? David laughed, but there was no humor in it. Watching security footage from that house. The police showed us some of it as part of Jake's statements. The way you moved, the way you assessed threats, the way you controlled. A dangerous situation without anyone getting seriously hurt it was like watching someone speak a language I didn't even know existed. I remembered that night in fragments, muscle memory taking over, training asserting itself when civilian niceties proved inadequate. It hadn't felt heroic at the time, just necessary. I spent 3 years dismissing skills that literally saved my son's life, David continued. 3 years treating you like a charity case who needed our help getting back on his feet, when the truth was that you were the only one in this family who was actually prepared for the real world. David, let me finish, please. He took a shaky breath. I work in finance. I move money around, create investment strategies, help rich people get richer. Important work, I told myself. Sophisticated work that required education and training and expertise. It is important work. Is it because when my son was in real danger, none of my sophisticated skills mattered? My MBA didn't help. My business connections were useless. My understanding of market dynamics and risk assessment, completely irrelevant. The word hung between us, heavy with irony. David was using the same term he'd applied to my military service, but now he was applying it to himself. But you, he continued, you knew how to read a situation, how to assess genuine threats, how to act decisively when action was required. You knew how to fight for someone you loved without losing yourself in the process. Jake appeared in the doorway, having come inside for a drink of water. He paused when he saw us talking, unsure whether to interrupt. Come here, son, David said. I want you to hear this. Jake approached cautiously, still holding his water glass. The family dynamics were shifting daily now, old patterns breaking down as everyone tried to figure out their new roles. I'm apologizing to your uncle, David said, for the things I said about his military service, for the way I treated him. Like his experiences didn't matter, and I'm apologizing to you. For being so focused on the kind of success I understood that I couldn't see the kinds of danger you were actually facing. Jake sat down at the table, his expression serious. I know you were trying to protect me in your own way. I was trying to protect you from becoming like him, David said, nodding toward me. Someone who'd seen too much, experienced too much violence, been shaped by circumstances I couldn't understand or control. I wanted you to have a clean life, a safe life, a predictable life. But Uncle Marcus's life isn't dirty or unsafe, Jake said quietly. It's just different from yours. And when I needed someone who understood how dangerous people operate, how predators think, how to fight back against people who wanted to hurt me, his experience was exactly what saved me. David nodded slowly. I'm beginning to understand that. I'm beginning to understand that the world is more complicated and more dangerous than I wanted to admit. That pretending otherwise doesn't actually protect anyone. So what does this mean, Jake asked. For our family, I mean? David looked at me, then back at his son. It means I stop treating your uncle like someone who needs to be fixed or redirected. It means I start listening when he raises concerns about your safety or well-being. And it means I acknowledge that there are different kinds of strength, different kinds of intelligence, different kinds of value. And it means, Jake added, that we stop pretending that money and status are the same thing as actual security. Was a mature observation from a 15-year-old who'd learned some hard lessons about the difference between appearance and reality. Jake had discovered that wealth could make you a target as easily as it could protect you, that the right connections could be dangerous if you didn't know how to evaluate people's true motives. Your uncle's experience matters, David said to Jake. His training matters, his instincts matter, and his willingness to act when acting was necessary. That matters most of all. As we sat in the afternoon light, I realized that the family photo on the mantle would need to be updated. Not because our physical arrangement had changed, but because our understanding of each other had shifted fundamentally. I was no longer the black sheep, trying to find his place in their world. I was a full member of a family that was finally learning to value all of its members for who they actually were. The thank you letter Jake had written wasn't just about gratitude, it was about recognition. Recognition that protection comes in many forms, that strength isn't always measured in dollars or degrees, and that sometimes the person who seems most out of place is exactly the person you need when everything falls apart. David still didn't fully understand what I'd experienced overseas, and he probably never would. But he was beginning to understand that not everything valuable could be measured by his civilian standards, and that was enough. It was a start. The family counseling appointment card was tucked into the corner of Sarah's bathroom mirror, a small reminder of the weekly sessions that had become as routine as grocery shopping or soccer practice. Dr. Elena Vasquez specialized in trauma recovery and family systems, and she'd been helping us navigate the aftermath of Jake's experience with the patience of someone who understood that healing happened in increments, not breakthroughs. The interesting thing about your family, Dr. Vasquez had said during our third session, is that the crisis didn't create your communication problems, it revealed them. Marcus felt marginalized. Jake felt misunderstood. David felt unappreciated. And Sarah felt caught in the middle. The trafficking situation just made those dynamics impossible to ignore. She was right, of course. The criminal investigation had wrapped up with plea deals and prison sentences, but the family work was ongoing. We were learning to talk to each other about things that mattered, instead of dancing around difficult topics with polite conversation. In careful silences, Uncle Marcus, Jake said one Saturday afternoon as we worked on his car, a 2010 Honda Civic that David had bought him for his 16th birthday. Do you think things would have been different if Grandma and Grandpa were still alive? I paused in my examination of his brake pads, considering the question. Our parents had died in a car accident 2 years before I'd enlisted, leaving Sarah and me to navigate young adulthood without their guidance. Different how? I don't know. Maybe Dad would have been less worried about doing everything perfectly. Maybe you would have had someone to talk to when you came back from Afghanistan. It was an insightful observation from someone who was still figuring out how family relationships worked. Jake had identified something I'd never quite articulated, that David's need to control every variable in his family's life might have come from the early loss of his own parents, and that my isolation after military service might have been worse because I'd had no parental figures to provide perspective. Maybe, I said. Or maybe they would have made everything more complicated. Jake laughed. That's what families do, right? Make things more complicated. Among other things, we worked in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of easy companionship that had developed between us since the incident. Jake had started asking me to teach him practical skills, basic car maintenance, home repair, situational awareness. Not because he was planning a military career, because he'd learned the value of being prepared for unexpected situations. Marcus. Sarah appeared in the garage doorway holding her phone. David's on his way home early. He has something he wants to discuss with all of us. Jake and I exchanged glances. Family announcements had taken on new significance since we'd started therapy. Everyone was being more intentional about communication, more direct about addressing problems before they escalated into crises. When David arrived 20 minutes later, he was carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the kind of expression that suggested good news rather than family drama. I got a job offer today, he announced as we gathered in the living room. Corporate security consulting. The company specializes in protecting executives and their families from exactly the kind of threats Jake encountered. You mean the kind of threats you didn't believe were real? Jake asked, but his tone was curious rather than accusatory. The kind of threats I didn't know how to recognize, David corrected. That's why they want me. Someone with business experience, who's also had personal exposure to these criminal operations. Sarah looked puzzled. But you don't know anything about security. No, but I know about corporate culture, business relationships, and family vulnerabilities. And I have access to a consultant with extensive military and tactical experience. He was looking at me as he said this, and I realized where the conversation was heading. They want both of us, David continued. You as the technical expert, me as the business interface. Protecting families like ours from predators who specialize in exploiting wealth and privilege. The irony was perfect. David's dismissal of my military background had nearly cost him his son, but now that same background was being offered as the foundation for a new career, one that would let me use my skills to protect other families from the kind of manipulation Jake had experienced. What do you think? Sarah asked me. I thought about the police report Detective Morrison had shown me, about the 17 other families who'd been victimized by the same operation. I thought about parents who'd made the same mistakes David had made, and kids who'd fallen into the same traps Jake had encountered. I think there are a lot of families out there who could use this kind of protection, I said. And I think, Jake added, that Uncle Marcus's irrelevant combat experience might be relevant after all. David winced at the callback to his dinner. Tabo comment, but he was learning to accept accountability for his past misjudgments rather than defending them. The salary is good, David said. Good enough that you could move out of that apartment and into something more comfortable, maybe. Somewhere closer to us. Closer to them. 6 months ago, I'd been the outsider sleeping in their guest room while I figured out my civilian life. Now I was being invited to relocate closer to their family, to become a more integrated part of their daily reality. Something else, David said, his tone becoming more serious. Jake wants to get involved in victim advocacy work, speaking to other teenagers about recognizing manipulation and recruitment tactics. We'd need to be careful about that, I said. He's still processing his own experience. Dr. Vasquez thinks it might actually help with his recovery, Sarah interjected, turning his trauma into something useful for other people. I looked at Jake, who was watching the conversation with the kind of focused attention that told me this mattered to him. What do you think? I asked him. I think there are kids out there right now who are getting the same kind of attention I got, being made to feel special and important by people who just want to use them. Maybe if they heard from someone who got out. It was the same instinct that had driven me to military service, the desire to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Jake was discovering that courage wasn't just about facing danger, but about using your experience to help others avoid the dangers you'd survived. We'd do it together, David said. Family presentations about recognizing threats, corporate seminars about protecting executives' children, law enforcement training about how these operations target wealthy families. A family business built around the lessons we'd learned the hard way. It wasn't the career path any of us had planned, but it was one that made sense given everything we'd been through. One condition, I said, we do this right. No cutting corners. No pretending we know more than we do. If we're going to help other families, we need to be absolutely certain we're giving them accurate information. Agreed, David said immediately as we talked through the details of this unexpected opportunity. I realized that our family dynamics had shifted in ways I never could have predicted. David was no longer the dismissive brother-in-law who saw my military service as a liability. Jake was no longer the isolated teenager looking for acceptance in dangerous places. And I was no longer the outsider trying to find my place in their civilian world. We were becoming something new, a family that had learned to value each other's strengths, instead of focusing on each other's differences. It had taken a crisis to teach us those lessons, but maybe that was what families were for, learning together, growing together, and protecting each other through whatever challenges came next. The job offer letter from Sentinel. Family Protection Services was everything David had promised and more. Base salary, performance bonuses, health benefits, and a relocation allowance that would let me move into a house just 15 minutes from Sarah's neighborhood. After 3 years of struggling to find my place in the civilian world, I was being offered a career that not only valued my military experience, but made it the centerpiece of meaningful work. Congratulations, Jake said, reading over my shoulder as I reviewed the contract details. You're officially relevant again. I laughed at his dry humor, but there was truth in the observation. For the first time since leaving the military, I felt like I was being asked to be myself rather than trying to become someone else. The skills I'd developed in Afghanistan threat assessment, tactical planning, crisis response weren't obstacles to overcome, but assets to be deployed in service of protecting other families. How does it feel? Sarah asked, joining us at the kitchen table where I'd spread out all the paperwork. Unexpected, I admitted. 6 months ago, I was wondering if I'd ever find work that mattered. Now I'm being offered a position that's basically custom designed for someone with my background. That's because we finally understand what your background actually means, David said, appearing with coffee for everyone. I spent 3 years seeing your military service as a detour from real life, when it was actually preparation for exactly this kind of work. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The family crisis that had nearly destroyed Jake had also revealed capabilities in me that none of us had fully appreciated. My combat experience hadn't made me unsuitable for civilian life, had it made me uniquely qualified for civilian protection. When do you start? Jake asked. 2 weeks. It's time to finish up at the warehouse. find a place to live, and complete the company's certification program. Certification program. Corporate security is different from military operations, I explained. Different rules of engagement, different legal considerations, different ethical frameworks. I need to learn how to apply my tactical knowledge within civilian constraints. Jake nodded thoughtfully, like learning a new language that uses familiar words. It was another insightful observation from someone who'd grown remarkably mature over the past few months. Jake's experience with the trafficking ring had forced him to confront adult realities much earlier than most teenagers. But he was processing those lessons with wisdom that impressed even Dr. Vasquez. Speaking of which, David said Jake has something to tell you about his victim advocacy plans. Jake straightened in his chair, suddenly looking nervous. Detective Morrison wants me to speak at a law enforcement conference next month about recruitment tactics and warning signs that adults should watch for. That's a big responsibility, I know. But Uncle Marcus, there are police officers and social workers and school counselors who deal with cases like mine all the time. If I can help them understand how these operations work from the victim's perspective. He trailed off, but I could see the determination in his eyes. Jake had found his own way of transforming trauma into purpose, of using his painful experience to potentially save other kids from similar situations. What do your parents think? We think he's ready, Sarah said. Dr. Vasquez agrees. And honestly, watching him practice his presentation, he's incredibly. The updated family photo sits on my desk now. In the home office of the house I bought 6 blocks from Sarah's neighborhood. In this picture, we're all genuinely smiling, not the forced expressions of people trying to look happy, but the relaxed faces of a family that has learned to see each other clearly. Jake is 17 now, senior in high school who speaks at conferences around the country about predatory recruitment and family protection. He's been accepted to 3 universities with full scholarships. It's not because of his victim status, but because of the maturity and insight he's developed in transforming his experience into advocacy work. Uncle Marcus, he said last week as we drove home from a presentation in San Diego, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't followed your instincts that night? I think about that question more often than I probably should. Not with regret or dwelling on what-ifs, but as a reminder of how quickly life can change when someone finally decides to act on what they know to be true. I try not to, I said. But I'm grateful every day that you trusted me enough to make that phone call. I'm grateful you were the kind of person I could call. 2 years after that terrifying night in the Hollywood Hills, our family has become something none of us could have imagined. David and I work together as partners in Sentinel Family Protection Services, which has grown from a 2-person operation to a team of 12 specialists who provide security consulting to families across California and Nevada. Our client list includes executives, celebrities, politicians, and ordinary families who've learned that wealth can make you a target as easily as it can protect you. Sarah has returned to school to become a licensed family therapist, specializing in trauma recovery and family systems. She says watching our family heal taught her about the difference between managing problems and actually solving them. You know what I've learned? She told me recently as we watched Jake practice his latest presentation. Protection isn't about controlling every variable in someone's life. It's about preparing them to handle whatever variables they encounter. It's a lesson that applies to more than just family dynamics. In my work with Sentinel, I've learned that the most effective security isn't about building walls high enough to keep all threats out tits, about building awareness and capabilities strong enough to respond effectively when threats inevitably appear. David has surprised me the most with his capacity for growth and change. The man who once dismissed my military experience as irrelevant now introduces me at business meetings as the tactical expert who saved my son's life. He's learned to value different kinds of intelligence and strength, to recognize that his corporate skills and my military training complement each other in ways that make both of us more effective. I used to think success meant never having to face anything unpredictable or dangerous, he told me last month. Now, I understand that. Real success means being prepared when unpredictable and dangerous things happen anyway. The criminal case that started everything has long since concluded. Vincent Reeves and 14 of his associates received federal sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. The 17 victims and their families have all received restitution. Though money can't undo the psychological damage done to children who trusted the wrong adults. But there have been positive outcomes too. The investigation led to changes in how law enforcement recognizes and responds to predatory recruitment. Social media companies have implemented new protocols for identifying suspicious adult-child communications. School districts have developed training programs to help teachers and counselors spot warning signs of criminal grooming. Jake's advocacy work has reached thousands of teenagers, parents, and professionals who work with at-risk youth. Will never know how many kids avoided dangerous situations because they recognized the warning signs Jake taught them to watch for. But the letters we receive suggest the number is significant. Mr. Rivera, one recent letter from a high school student in Texas began, "I heard Jake speak at our school last month. This weekend, some older guys started paying attention to me at a party, and I remembered what he said about adults who try to make teenagers feel special for the wrong reasons. I left the party and called my parents. Thank you for teaching him how to help people like me." Letters like that remind me why this work matters, why the experiences that once felt like burdens have become tools for protecting others. Jake was right when he said that maybe everything that happened to him was supposed to happen, not because suffering is inevitable or deserved, but because people who've survived dangerous situations are uniquely qualified to help others avoid or escape similar dangers. The family photo on my desk captures a moment from last Christmas. Gathered around Sarah's dinner table for a meal that felt genuinely celebratory rather than obligatory. David is laughing at something Jake said. Sarah is serving pie with the satisfied expression of someone who knows her family is finally whole. And I'm sitting where I belong, not at the far end of the table as an afterthought, but right in the middle of the people who matter most to me. 3 years ago, I came home from Afghanistan wondering if my service had any relevance to civilian life. 2 years ago, my family learned that the answer was yes, more relevance than any of us had understood. Now I know that the real question was never whether my military experience mattered, but whether I would find people who valued it enough to let me use it in service of something meaningful. Family, I've learned, isn't just about blood relationships or a shared history. It's about people who see your strengths even when they come wrapped in experiences they can't fully understand. It's about protection that works both ways, keeping each other safe, not just from external threats, but from the internal tendency to settle for less than we deserve from the people who claim to love us. Jake graduates next month and heads to college in the fall, where he plans to study criminal justice and psychology. He wants to become a federal agent specializing in crimes against children, taking the advocacy work he's done as a teenager into a career dedicated to protecting other kids from predators. "I finally know what I want to be when I grow up," he told me recently. "Someone like you, someone who keeps people safe. It's the highest compliment I've ever received, and the best evidence that my irrelevant combat experience turned out to be the most relevant thing our family ever needed. Sometimes the skills you think you'll never use again are exactly the skills that save the people you love most. And sometimes the person who seems most out of place is exactly the person who belongs at the center of everything that matters."